Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Tony Millichap. So would you ask Mr. Millichap to come in, please?
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Millichap.
Good morning.
Right, all ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's Grange.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Millichap.
Good morning.
So when we broke off yesterday, we were in the middle of discussing the updated BBA certificate from December 2013, if you recall. We'd looked
Yes.
at that certificate. And I just want to remind you of a couple of passages in the transcript before we pick up that topic again. If we could go to the transcript from yesterday, day 81, page 192. And I want to look at lines 9 to 22. So I asked you now, do you accept that this is the first time a BBA certificate for K15 made clear that the test data from the May 05 test is only applicable to the specific tested system and that further testing will be required for any other combination of materials? And you said, yes, it's clearer. And then I say, were you made aware of this significant change to the content of the behaviour in relation to fire section of the certificate? Yes, I was aware it was evolving. And I ask, was that something that Kingspan had been attempting to avoid, something quite that clear and straightforward? And you say, I don't believe that's the case. I believe this is probably a growing understanding with the BBA. And you also told us earlier in your evidence yesterday, if we look at page 77, that there'd been a degree of frustration about delays to issuing BBA certificates. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So at the top of that page, I put a question. I say 2 BBA employees have told the inquiry that this certificate was not published till July 2013. That was the April 2010 version. And you say that would seem like a very long delay, even in the context of the BBA. I say yes. And you say for some time, we were very frustrated around the turnaround of these types of certificates. With quite a few of them, it was always frustrating to try and progress getting them released. It would often take over a year. And then I asked, in your experience, did Kingspan always get back to the BBA quickly when suggested amendments were proposed to certificates? And the answer was yes. So that was your evidence there. And you also tell us in your witness statement for the transcript, this is at paragraph 17 on page 32, that in your view the BBA were incapable of being influenced against their will, and it was an organisation of integrity, and their assessment criteria were black and white. Is that right?
Yes.
That was your evidence. Now, I then want to look at some correspondence that occurred in the run-up to that December 13 certificate. Were you aware that the BBA had been writing to Kingspan since November 2012, seeking approval on a new draft certificate for K15 to be issued?
Not specifically.
Let's look at some correspondence on this. KIN 409353. This is an email chain between Mr. Meredith, Mr. Clark, and Mr. Mills in November 2012. If we look at the bottom of the chain, page 5, what we see is an email from Mandy Osman of the BBA attaching a draft proposed certificate for K15. We attach for your approval a draft of the proposed certificates, which to be sent to the regulatory authorities and our technical assessors for comment.
Yes.
And then she explains what the purpose is of you seeing it. And in the second sentence of that second paragraph, she said this is also your opportunity to comment and request revisions. If we move up the chain, so that's 5th of November 2012. There's then a chaser email sent on the 29th of November 2012. And the next, on page 4, she chases again. Further to my email, I note we've not yet received your approval of the certificate. We'd like to maintain progress. If we've not heard from you by the 6th of December, we'll assume you're happy. So she says that to Mr. Mills at that point. There's then some further discussion on the same day. And then if we go up to page 2, there's an email on 29th of November 2012 at 14:29 at the bottom of page 2. And Mr. Meredith goes back to the BBA, copying in Joel Clark, and said, OK, I've copied my colleague Joel, who'll probably be leading the way with this work in the future. However, we shall come back to you as soon as possible. And then if we go up the chain, still on page 2 to the next email, we can see the BBA are chasing again on the 3rd of January 2013. Dear Mr. Meredith, please may we have your approval of the draft certificate to maintain progress.
Yes.
You see that. And then the question that I want to ask you at this point is, during November and December 2012, did any of your team show you the BBA's draft certificate? Do you remember receiving it at that early stage?
I will have been aware of the draft and trying to progress it to something that that team were comfortable with. I don't recall getting involved in the detail of what it was that they were hoping to get into the certificate.
Right.
It does seem like it's not happening quickly enough from
Yes.
our side in this instance.
Yes, we can see that. And then if we go to the very top email in the chain on page 1, this is sent by Mr. Meredith to Joel Clark and Gareth Mills. He says this: as Gareth has the experience on what we can and cannot get away with, we need to take the lead from him and perhaps sit down and work out our approach ASAP. Gareth, have you drafted anything to the BBA reference this draft that can be circulated? Now, did you know at the time that that was the approach being taken by members of your team, i.e. what we can and cannot get away with the BBA?
No, I think that's quite loose language. It was always a feedback loop, if you like, in that we were able to comment on what we saw as the most appropriate content certificate from our point of view. But there was always, a strong point of view from the BBA as well. So I don't think it was ever coercive or negative in that regard. I think it was just a to and fro.
I see. So you wouldn't accept that there was a culture of Kingspan trying to minimise the limitations on the use of K15 rather than being transparent and accurate in terms of what's in these certificates?
I think at all times we were keen that the product could be seen in the most positive light. So we would always do our best to extend the scope of relevance of the product in a way that was accurate. Possibly looking at this, whether we are pushing a little bit too far on this occasion. It's obviously trying to achieve a balance.
I see. Yep. Let's look at another email chain now on this topic. KIN 405572. It's a long chain that runs from November 2012 to 14th of January 2013. It starts on page 11 with the same emails we've just been looking at from Mandy Osman of the BBA, asking about comments on the draft. And
Yes.
if we go up, and then I want to move up to page 6. There's an email from Mr. Meredith at 16:55 on the 7th of January 2013. That's it. And he says, we won't be able to get into the detail about the certificate during tomorrow's BBA review meeting. However, we should consider doing ASAP. So it looks like there's going to be some kind of meeting. Do you remember attending a meeting about the wording of this certificate?
No.
And then if we look on page 4 and we go up the string, there's an email of the 9th of January 2013 at 16:06. And this is from Joel Clark to Mr. Meredith, but you're copied in here. So you've become copied in on this string.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you about this email. Mr. Clark says, "Sorry, perhaps I wasn't clear. I'm fully aware we want it as open and delimiting as possible. That's blindingly obvious, is it not? However, on the basis of some of the comments flying around yesterday, my first thoughts are that we're not going to have it put back to how it was by butting heads. I don't even think they'll give us the get out of contact the manufacturer. The phrase used more than once yesterday was, they're on to us. Even if being used in a tongue-in-cheek way, we're not doing anything immoral or illegal after all, it does perhaps reflect the position we are in." And then he says, if worst case, we have to let them say in small letters that anything other than 60 millimetres should be assessed, then we need an assessment of suitable weight, etc. He says, he then ends this email, "I'd love it back to how it was, but feel it unlikely, that's all." Now, do you remember receiving that email and reading it?
I have seen that email, yes.
And was it blindingly obvious that Kingspan wanted the certificate as open and delimiting as possible?
Within the realms of what was right and correct, yes.
I see. What do you think is meant by "they're on to us"? Did anyone ever report back to you after the meeting with the BBA and say, by the way, they've realised that there's been problems with the past certificates and they're on to us now? Did anyone say that to you?
No, not specifically. I think that is what Joel is alluding to in this. I think we would always promote our position where we could. I think it does actually also, from the flip side, state that the BBA didn't let us get away with things, that weren't accurate and true.
Well, we've looked at some earlier versions of the BBA certificate where you've accepted already that there were passages in those that weren't strictly accurate. Are you saying that you never pushed for wording that was anything other than accurate? Is that your evidence?
Yes.
I see. And it's right, isn't it, that they decided to put an end to the use of the words "contact the manufacturer." Joel Clark calls that the get-out clause there.
Yes.
And that phrase didn't appear anymore in the behaviour in relation to fire certificate. That's right, isn't it, after that?
Yes.
Now, let's look at some correspondence from nearer the time the amended certificate was issued now on the same subject, KIN 405870. And if we go down to the second page, there's an email from Mandy Osman on the 6th of December at 14:48, attaching a revised copy of the final draft and saying that they would welcome your approval. And then moving up to the next email, we see that Gareth Mills has forwarded the final draft to Joel Clark and to Mr. Meredith. Copy of the updated draft of the K15 certificate, which came through on Friday. I've not had a chance to look over it yet. And then if we look the next email in the chain, we see there, 10th of December 2013, Joel Clark then sets out his thoughts to Mr. Mills and Mr. Meredith. And he says, "Just been going through this. The first paragraph is now exactly as it used to be, which is very good news. Both versions attached for easy reference. There's a mention of some potential restrictions at 8.2 and 8.3 as per the following." And he says what they are. 8.2 note 1, that was a footnote. This test result relates only to this specific construction, etc. And then at 8.3, the product incorporated in the construction defined at section 8.2 can be used in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level. Fire breaks should be used at every floor level after the first floor. And Mr. Clark goes on, given that the note at 8.2 is in the smallest possible font and buried deep in the certificate itself, we have made significant progress when compared with the last draft. the wording at 8.3 could be read as a restriction, but logically speaking, it does not preclude the use of other thicknesses. And then personally, I believe this certificate is now acceptable, at least insofar as it's much less restrictive than it was, and I do not believe we'll get any joy in trying to have this last restriction removed. Happy to take on board comments, though, before going back to the BBA. And that footnote at 8.2, we looked at that, do you remember, yesterday? It was
Yes.
in much smaller font. Can you explain to us why Kingspan would consider it significant progress that the accurate limitation about the test result was in the smallest possible font and buried deep in the certificate?
No, I don't agree with Joel's comments on that occasion. I think it's internal communication. I still believe that the process of getting to the content of these certificates was robustly monitored and managed by the BBA. That there is evidence there that that team were, I think, pushing a little bit harder than they should have been, but they were trying to get to the best wording by compromise with the BBA.
Can we look at the top email in this chain? We can see there that this has been copied to you, this chain. You're CC'd onto Mr. Meredith's response to Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mr. Meredith said, thanks for your persistence with this. Next week we could have some new test results. Now, do you remember seeing Joel Clark's email at the time?
I will have, yes. I don't recall it specifically now.
And you say you didn't agree with his comments on that occasion, or you don't agree with his comments on that occasion. Did you say anything to him about this? You're one of his managers. Did you say, Joel, that's simply not acceptable. That can't be the approach that we take? Did you ever say that?
I don't recall that I did specifically to Joel. He would have reported directly to Ivor. There were constant interventions with the team about what is and isn't appropriate. It absolutely isn't an excuse, but this was internal correspondence. These guys work closely together, and I think the language is a bit loose, honestly.
Was this behaviour condoned by you at the time, looking back on it?
No.
Now, if we can go back to your witness statement and look at what you tell us at paragraph 7.34 on page 36 of your statement. This is where you're dealing with this issue of the certificate on the 17th of December 2013. We can see that from the top of the page. And you're asked, why was a second issue of this certificate produced at this stage? And you say, I can't recall from memory, however, for the purpose of preparing this witness statement, I've been shown internal email correspondence, which leads me to believe that Kingspan requested that the BBA make changes to the BBA certificates for all of the Cooltherm products to reflect new agreed lambda values. And subsequent to this, the BBA made the decision to fully reissue the BBA certificate for K15 to reflect these new lambda values, but also to upgrade regulations and add a new acoustic section within the certificate. The amendments were to do with thermal efficiency rather than fire performance. Now, that's simply not correct, is it?
No, not on the evidence of that chain.
No.
It looks like they did a complete review of the certificate, given that there were other changes that needed to be brought in.
Yeah. Now, just staying with the BBA certificate, but moving on to the NHBC and what they were told. If we look at paragraph 7.39 of your witness statement on page 38 now. actually, we should pick it up, the question before. So if we look at the bottom of page 37, you're asked the question, were you aware prior to the issue of the certificate of any issues raised with Kingspan by the NHBC in relation to the use of K15 on buildings with a floor over 18 metres? If so, please describe the issue or issues. Please explain when and how these were raised by and with whom and any action Kingspan took. And you say, no, I was not aware. And then, but in fact, what we know is that the NHBC wrote to Kingspan regarding the change to the BBA certificate and raising concerns that it was not mentioned to them at a meeting that was had on the 17th of January 2014. If we can look at NHB 50674. This is an email from Dave White of the NHBC to Richard Bromwich and Mr. Meredith. You're not copied into this. And the subject is fire performance of K15 over 18 metres. And in the second paragraph of this email, he says, I think that we established and agreed at our meeting in January that the K15 insulation product had only been tested for fire performance to BS 8414, where K15 boards are installed, using direct mechanical fixing onto solid masonry blockwork backing wall. Now, did you know that that had been established at the January meeting with the NHBC?
I don't ever recall seeing this email. That doesn't mean to say I wouldn't have reviewed it once I got involved with the NHBC discussions later.
I see. And then in that last paragraph, he says, or the next paragraph down, please could you read the attached memo which explains our concerns with regard to the recent reissue of BBA certificate 084582. We would very much appreciate your response to these concerns and any update that you can provide on further accredited testing that may be underway. And if we can then go to that memorandum, so they attach a memo, that's at NHB 50675. If we could look at the top of the page first, it's headed BBA certificate, fire performance of Kingspan K15, and they say in the top paragraph, since our last meeting on 17th of January 2014, we have become aware that a newly issued version of BBA certificate has been issued for Kingspan Coulter K15 insulation board, i.e. second issue, 17th December 2013. The reissue of this BBA certificate was not part of the discussion at the previous meeting to discuss fire performance of Kingspan K15 insulation on external walls over 18 metres. However, from this meeting, NHBC had understood that further testing would be scheduled by Kingspan to test the K15 product in compliance with BRE 135 recommendations, including typical representative types of wall build-up for framed multi-storey buildings. And then they go on, following the January meeting, no further test reports have been forwarded to NHBC, Standards and Technical, to show how the K15 insulation board product can perform within typical framed wall building structures under the testing defined by BR 135 and 8414 for fire performance of multi-storey building envelopes. Now, can you help us as to why that amended BBA certificate for K15 had not been mentioned to the NHBC at the meeting in January 2014?
My conclusion would be that it hadn't been actually issued at that point, or it hadn't been passed through to the sales representatives of the company. If it was an issue on the 17th of December, I don't know when we will have received physical copies that we were then able to distribute.
What Mr. White does in the passage of the memo after the bit we've read is he goes through and he looks at the differences between the BBA certificates. He says, looking at the reissued version of the certificate, amendments now exclude important information on fire resistance testing that's been carried out in terms of the following. And he sets out some passages. And he says the above information has been removed. And then if we can look at the last 3 paragraphs, we can go down. He says this in the last 3 paragraphs: I hope that you can appreciate that it is important for us to understand under what technical basis the changes were made to BBA Certificate 08452. In reading through the new certificate, it now appears less clear than before in providing key information relating to fire performance in design. We are very much aware that key aspects in fire performance of building products are very important in making correct design decisions for safe construction, particularly of tall residential buildings over 18 metres high. Where design-related information on fire performance is ambiguous, this will increase the possibility of misinterpretation and may create greater risk in terms of the decision-making needed to provide adequately designed fire-resistant buildings. Clarification on the above would be much appreciated, as well as any updated information that you can provide on the additional fire performance testing that either has been carried out or is currently in progress since our meeting in January. So it's clear, isn't it, that the NHBC were very concerned about aspects of this new 2013 certificate.
Yes, from that, yes.
And were you aware at the time of those concerns?
Not at the time this was issued. I don't recall seeing that letter, actually. At this stage, I understood that Ivor, along with Richard Bromwich, were managing the NHBC query.
Mr. White specifically asks for any information about testing that's recently been carried out or is being undertaken. We can see that in this email. He's asking, in this memo, he's asking for any, in that last paragraph, any updated information that you can provide on the additional fire performance testing that either has been carried out or is currently in progress. Can you help us? Why had Kingspan not already told the NHBC about a test to BS 8414 Part 2 carried out on the 7th of January 2014, which could not be classified to BR 135?
No, at that time we didn't see any value either way in issuing those failed tests. I think we did change position on that somewhat later in the correspondence with the NHBC and actually did disclose those tests as well.
If we could go now to KIN 402169. This is a letter almost a month later, on the 20th of March 2014, from Mr. Meredith to Mr. White, and it appears to be Mr. Meredith's response to Dave White's memo that we just looked at. And if we go to the bottom of page 2 of the letter, we can see you are copied in to this letter.
Yes.
Now, does that help you recall whether you were aware of Dave White's email and memo as well as this response at the time?
I would likely have reviewed that yes, and probably supported Ivor in creating a response.
Yes. And do you remember discussing this response with Mr. Meredith before this letter was drafted and sent?
I can't recall a specific conversation, no.
If we go up to the top of the letter, if we could look more at the content of the letter. In summary, what he says is that the BBA certificate was reissued due to its age. Do you see that at the beginning of the second paragraph?
Yes.
The revised BBA Agremont certificate was reissued due to its age. The revised content was agreed with the BBA as being representative and appropriate at the time it went to print. And then he carries on about the testing. He says that the omission of the test report number from the certificate for the May 2005 test to 8414 was an oversight. That's in the 7th line of paragraph 2. 3 lines up from that, in that paragraph. The omission of the actual test report number is an oversight by the BBA. However, we would trust that the fact that we have tested to 84141 is apparent and shall address the omission during the next certificate review. And then he goes on in the next paragraph to say that the EN 13651 testing is about fire resistance and not of direct relevance to K15 at height. Now, the BBA certificate was not renewed simply due to its age, was it?
No, that's not strictly accurate. It may have been part of the reason.
And Kingspan had fought to keep its content regarding fire performance as unrestricted and broad as possible. Do you agree?
Yes, that was the approach, whilst maintaining it was still accurate.
And then if we go to the penultimate paragraph of this letter on page 2, so, sorry, let's just look at the top of this page first before we get to that. We can see, he says, for clarity, our opinion is, it is our opinion that our Cool-therm K15 product would be fit for purpose if installed onto a non-combustible substrate, horizontal cavity barriers. And then it's talking about the LABC registered detail certificate there. Do you see that?
Yes.
That's wording that we've seen many times before. And then he goes on about Kingspan Insulation have tested it to 84141 in the next paragraph, fitted to a non-combustible substrate behind a non-combustible cladding system. And then if we look in the next paragraph, he says, as discussed at our meeting in January, Kingspan Insulation Limited do have an ongoing test regime around facade test standards to increase the applicability of Cool-therm K15 use in high-rise above 18 metres, and hope to be able to bring some further evidence to our meeting in April at your offices in Milton Keynes. So it would appear, doesn't it, that that failed test on the 7th of January 2014 had still not been mentioned to the NHBC by this time.
It would appear that, yes.
And the day before this letter's the 20th of March, on the 19th of March, a second test to 8414 Part 2 had been carried out on a system incorporating K15, hadn't it?
Yes.
Why is that not included in Mr. Meredith's letter?
I don't know what stage we would have been at in understanding the outcome of that test. I don't know.
And that tested system could not, in the end, be classified to BR135, could it?
No.
No. Now, you were specifically asked in your witness statement whether you were ever made aware of any concerns raised in respect of the content or wording of any BBA certificate, and your response was, no, I was not. Can you explain why that was your answer, given the documents that we've just looked at?
Yes, purely that I hadn't recalled this early correspondence with the NHBC. Front of mind was the correspondence latterly with them.
I see. And you accept now that there are aspects of this response which are not entirely satisfactory, would you agree?
In terms that it doesn't fully disclose the ongoing testing?
That, and that it says that the BBA certificate was updated due to its age?
Yes, I'd accept it on those two, yes.
Let's move to a different topic now, which is the testing to 8414 Part 2 that was carried out on systems incorporating K15 during your time as head of technical. We've already touched on some of these tests from January and March 2014, and I want to now ask you a little bit more about this. For now, I just want to ask you, why was that programme of testing started at that time in early 2014?
From memory, we were looking to do some additional tests around, obviously, broadening what information we were able to use to support the inquiries we were getting. As the discussion with the NHBC developed, we accepted their concerns and actually conceded that we would allow them to help formulate that testing regime going forward.
It's right, isn't it, that by January 2014, the Nhbc had requested evidence of compliance for any systems other than the one tested from May 2005. We've seen that.
Yes.
Do you agree? And it's the case that there'd also been an ultimatum from Wintec in October 2013, hadn't there, that they were going to express their concerns publicly about
Yes.
K15. Did those two matters have something to do with the decision to start testing again?
Yes, all of those matters, yes.
Yeah. Now, I want to look at this point at a spreadsheet that Kingspan have provided to the inquiry. This is KIN 30222357. So this is a spreadsheet where they've provided details of all the 8414 tests carried out on K15, commissioned at the BRE prior to the 14th of June 2017. And if we look on page 3, we can see the 7th of January 2014 test. And that was the first test after some time. There'd been tests in 2007 and 2008, but then a gap in testing. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And we can see that on the 7th of January 2014, the system that was tested, 3 columns along, was 8mm Trespa FR HPL, which is high pressure laminate, yes?
Yes.
And the test result was a fail. It was terminated early, and it's right, isn't it, that it also failed the thermocouple requirement on the temperatures?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. And it says there, if you look in the middle of that page, under the column properties of the tested insulation product, that they're unknown. Are you able to help us with precisely what the insulation product was that was tested in that January 14 test?
My investigations since, or getting up to speed with the issued documents since the inquiry was known, I was under the understanding that that was a modified product, a trial product, if you like. The only reference that I could find was something in the lamination meeting minutes. I believed it could have been a phosphoric acid modified product. But I'm not 100% confident on that.
This test must have required quite careful planning, given that there'd been no tests up to that point, and they were clearly, these were important tests, weren't they?
Yes.
So were you aware at the time that it was a modified version of K15 that was being trialled in this test?
Yes.
And why did you think that was?
Because of the experience on not being able to get a result to the Part 2 test with the claddings that we tried previously.
So does it follow that you were aware by this point that there had been problems with the K15 itself, i.e. the K15 you're selling, the new technology K15, in terms of how it performed in those 2007-2008 tests?
Yes, in terms of trying to achieve a pass with those systems, yes.
No, that's not the question I asked. Does it follow that you were aware by this point that there had been problems with the K15 itself in those earlier tests?
No.
So you're saying that you knew that there was going to be a modified product for this first test.
Yes.
Why didn't you think that you should be just testing the K15 you're selling? Why did you think it was appropriate to test a modified product at this point?
Because of the experience of trying to broaden the scope of applicability with a wider test programme. The experience had been in trying to get a system approval with the new technology K15 had been negative. We hadn't been able to do that. The result we had got in the 2005 test was with what was contrived at the time to be the least onerous condition. Clearly, to extend the scope, you would have to test something more onerous. And the experience had been that the product we'd used previously wasn't giving us those results.
I see. So does it follow from that answer that you were aware that there'd been issues with the K15 itself in terms of its performance in those 2007 and 2008 tests?
In terms that it will have a contribution to the outcome of the result, yes.
And that's why you were testing a modified version of K15 in these tests, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. This test, this January test, is not one that you mention in your witness statement at all, the January 2014 test.
Okay.
Is that because you'd just forgotten about it at the time, or can you help us as to why that is?
I can't. In my mind, I may have actually conflated this test with the one that preceded it. They were both a similar construction, and I may have got the two.
I see. Okay. So the next test, if we look down on this schedule, was the 19th of March in the next row. This was a test, again, these were all tests at 8414 Part 2. It was terminated early because flames breached the top of the test rig. That's right, isn't it?
It is.
And in this spreadsheet, what we see is it was carried out on Trespa decorative rain screen board, so a different Trespa product.
Yes.
Fail for early termination, and then we can see there it says trial product, thickness 80 millimetres, foil unperforated. Now, just looking at that foil there, was it your understanding that the January test had also been carried out on an unperforated foil?
I think that's most likely.
Yes. And it's most likely, isn't it, because concerns had been raised by Mr. Meredith and others about what the perforations were doing to the fire performance. That's right, isn't it?
That was one of Ivor's considerations, yes.
Yes. And we can see, so it's an unperforated foil. It's either 50 micron or 100 micron. So that's significantly thicker than the normal K15, the new tech K15 foil, which is 25 micron, yes?
Yes.
And we can also see that the core, it says it's R330 UF, calcium carbonate and polyol blend added. And then we've got alternative blowing agent. And would you agree that that alternative blowing agent was something called Solstice?
Yes.
And it's right, isn't it, that you were aware at the time that this test was not being carried out on the K15 product actually being sold to market?
It is right, yes.
And are you aware now that that test has been withdrawn as at October 2020?
Yes, as at the opening statement from Kingspan, yes.
Yes, because I think we touched on it yesterday. I think despite the fact it was a fail, some of that test data did make its way into desktop assessments. Were you aware of that?
I think I have seen correspondence to that effect, yes.
Yes. And then while we're on this spreadsheet, just looking at the landscape here, we've got then the 7th of July 2014 test. And we can see that that is on a terracotta tile, Taylor Maxwell Standard Classico terracotta tile. And we can see that that's a pass this time. And then in the properties of the tested insulation product, that's also a trial product.
Yes.
And again, were you aware of that at the time?
Yes.
And the foil says perforated and unperforated, 50 micron foil. So it's a thicker foil. Yes, it's 50 microns.
Yes.
And is your understanding at the time that it had one side that was perforated, one side unperforated?
I don't recall, but I have no reason to doubt that at all.
Can you help? That test, that July test, did Adrian Pargeter have any involvement in the planning of that test?
It's difficult. I don't recall at what stage Adrian became more involved. He would have been in a marketing role at this point, marketing and product development, in which case, yes, I believe he would have had some involvement. The fire focus group was steering the direction of these tests. There was obviously growing concern that we wanted to extend the body of evidence, and therefore, naturally, more people have got involved in making those decisions.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, you probably don't find it possible to help with this, but as I understand it, you're saying that the board that was used for this test had one side with perforated foil and one side with unperforated.
Yes.
Do you happen to know which way round it was fixed onto the substrate?
I would assume, given Ivor's concerns, that the perforated side would be against the structure, so with the unperforated side outermost.
But that's, you can't actually remember how it was done, I assume. It was.
No, I can't.
It may appear from the test report.
Yes, definitely. There may be photography as well of the sample being erected, dismantled.
Right, thank you.
I'm afraid the test report doesn't help us on that.
Does it not?
No.
Okay.
All the test report says is that it's K15. You don't see from the test report that it was an alternative K15 and what the differences were.
Thank you.
And just on that July test, we can see in that middle column it says alternative blowing agent. And again, this was a Solstice blown product, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you some more questions specifically now about that test carried out on the in March 2014 to 8414 Part 2. If we can go to KIN 3021907, and we start on page 3, and what we see here is an email in the middle of that page from Stephen Howard, 25th of March, 10:44, and he says, Ivor, I've discussed the test with Phil, and the current status is that you do not have a clear pass. And then on the same day, if we go to the email above, that email is forwarded to you, to Mr. Rochford, and a number of others on the 31st of March.
Yes.
And then if we go up again on page 2, Mr. Meredith's emails on the 31st of March at 13:23, he says to you and others, initial feedback from the BRE is that this test did not meet the requirements of BR 135 3rd edition. This is by no means the end of this, as we will be challenging this opinion and doing everything possible to get something usable out of the testing, whether this be an assessment for a different cladding or a shorter build, or we try and get them to issue a report based on the earlier version of the standard. The test is being dismantled this week, so hopefully we can demonstrate very little flame spread on the K15, and this will support the counter arguments that we are preparing. And he says, as mentioned, we have a meeting with TENOS, ARUP, IFC and TRESPA plan to analyse what we've learnt so far, as limiting the use of K15 to just non-combustible cladding types would be a big loss. I spoke to Malcolm on Friday and he advised we should proceed with the non-combustible terracotta cladding. So that was the next test done in July to terracotta. Following this news from the BRE, are we still in agreement about this? I shall know by the end of the week when I need the insulation for the next test by. However, the question remains about the insulation we choose to use. Is it possible to share the calorimeter results of the Solstice versus standard versus phosphoric that we performed at FTT last week? What would be FTT? Can you help us? It doesn't matter. He goes on. Does this support our views on the flammability, calorific content of the different phenolic foams? This would be good to look at alongside the video. Now, taking this in stages, were you aware of what the counter arguments were that were being prepared?
Yes. FTT, I can only assume, will have been a test laboratory.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Now, you tell us in your witness statement for the transcript, that's at paragraph 11.3 on page 53, you say this about the BRE. You say, while we were keen to receive feedback with respect to tests, I strongly believe that our interactions with the testers did not influence them.
Yes.
That's your evidence. But do you accept that you did try to influence them by your interactions with regards to this test in particular?
This test in particular, yes, I had quite a strong view on my interpretation of the BR 135 criteria.
If we look at paragraph 11.6 of your statement on page 54, in the third line of 11.6, starting on the right-hand side, you say this: Kingspan was not able to suggest amendments to the content relating to the observations and results of the test, i.e. the product's performance, as this was entirely within the BRE's remit and expertise. The types of comments that Kingspan could make were restricted to the physical description of the product tested. Now, that's simply not right, is it? It's not what happened with this March 2014 test, is it?
Well, actually, the outcome was we accepted their decision, and our protest didn't change anything.
Yes, but you say Kingspan was not able to suggest amendments to the content relating to the observations and results. The types of comments that Kingspan could make were restricted to the physical description of the product tested.
Sorry, yes, I think what I'm saying there is that obviously we couldn't influence the wording of the outcome of the actual test. It isn't strictly true in that we were able to obviously have some feedback with them, but the actual results or the outcome of a test was the BRE's remit.
Isn't it right that for this test you did actually get a test report out of them and then used it for desktop assessments?
I believe that was the case, yes.
Yes. Let's go back to Mr. Meredith's email that we were looking at, KIN 3021907 on page 2. In the second line, he says that we'll be challenging this opinion and doing everything possible to get something usable out of the testing. What did you understand him to mean by that?
At this point, it wasn't an official result based on... Predominantly, it was my view that there was some ambiguity in whether the fail mechanism was valid or not. I believe at this point we were hoping that we may actually get the BRE to reconsider their position at that time. I was keen to, ensure that we had that conversation in a timely way, that we weren't issued with an official fail before possibly that we'd then have to challenge and get taken back and reissued. I'd hoped that we might be able to get our point of view considered before the actual result was issued.
But you did end up getting something usable out of this, didn't you, in the end, that test report we've just discussed? that was then used in desktop assessments?
Yeah, I believe, yes, around this time, we were actually given feedback that there was value in all test reports, whether they were a pass or a fail, and an assessor could use that information.
And what you're trying to do here, aren't you, is to say, you can see it from the second paragraph, say that demonstrate there's very little flame spread on the K15. So you're trying to use this test to demonstrate that the K15 is performing okay, even though you've kept telling us again and again that you did know it's a system test.
Yes, because that information is valuable to an assessment.
If we go up the chain on page 1, there's an email from Gwyn Davis at the bottom of that page. He says, surely we risk making fools of ourselves trying to quarrel with them based on an earlier edition of BR 135. Now, that's what you were doing, wasn't it? By this point, there was a new edition of BR 135 from 2013 that made it clear that it was the whole test duration of 60 minutes that counted, not just the first 30 minutes. That's right, isn't it?
I'm not 100% on the chronology of the various BR135s that were released in relation to this test.
Well, you can take it from me that there was a third edition of BR135 in 2013.
Right, yes.
And that does seem to make sense in terms of why Gwyn Davis is saying we're going to make fools of ourselves trying to quarrel with them based on an earlier edition of BR135, because it was in that third edition that it made it clear that the full duration, 60 minutes, was relevant.
I didn't feel that was clear. That was the basis of our position that we presented to the BRE.
Yeah.
I believe there was a proposal to actually better confirm the test duration in the actual standard as well that was proposed after this. Right.
And then Mr. Davis goes on in that first paragraph. I feel we need to understand why they're terming this as a fail and how they've come to this decision, and then discuss internally the counter to this and meet with Phil and Stephen. So that would be Phil Clark and Stephen Howard, yes, of the BRE.
It would have been.
And then if we go to the top email in the chain, you write on the same day, you say, sorry, it's not the top email, it's the next one along, you say, let's not forget we're carefully pushing BRE for the result. Typically, this is not issued without the full report after 4 to 5 weeks. In the short term, we're just trying to understand our options whilst waiting for the full data and trying to sow some seeds to influence that result. In the event we do not get what we aimed for, stronger tactics will be employed. And then obviously Lindsay's welcome to attend a dismantle. We must be careful not to be too forceful at this stage. I will concurrently employ our solicitor to ensure they are fully briefed to support a challenge or defend any ongoing contracts. Now, can you help us? What do you mean by we're trying to sow some seeds to influence that result?
Yes, just that I wanted to ensure that our point of view was understood prior to the result being issued. My interpretation of that classification was that the second half hour of the test wasn't actually considered within the pass-fail criteria. I think there is wording to that effect. They did give us their point of view and their clarification on that, which ultimately we were obliged to accept. But as I said, there was then a proposal to put an amendment in the actual standard itself to further clarify the 60-minute duration. And I felt that at least demonstrated that there was some ambiguity as a minimum.
But it's more than that, isn't it? You say it was to ensure that our point of view was understood prior to the result being issued. You're actually wanting to try and influence the result, aren't you, by putting pressure on the BRE? But
based on our understanding of the pass-fail criteria, yes.
And then what were the stronger tactics that will be employed if you don't get what you aimed for? What did you mean by that?
We'd considered at this stage that we could formally challenge. We'd had raised a official complaint with BRE just to ensure that it did get considered properly.
And so did one of those tactics involve threatening litigation and bringing lawyers involved?
I don't know whether that was ever said to the BRE. It was just something that we considered to make sure that our point of view was properly considered.
If we then go to the email at the top of this chain, at the top of page 1, actually, sorry, look in a different email chain now, KIN 30104661. This is an email from you to Stephen Howard at the BRE on the 7th of May 2014. And you copy in to this email, you CC Toby Randall of Fenwick Elliott Solicitors. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then you say, we write further to our ongoing correspondence and prior to our meeting later this week. And then we would confirm the following. Having just received the full thermocouple data and video footage of the Part 2 test of the 19th of March, it is clear the pass-fail criteria for the first stage of the test was met, all as per the original indications on the test day. It is our firm belief the second section of this test does not have a pass-fail criteria, this being confirmed within BL 135B24, and is for recording observations only. It should also be noted it was confirmed immediately after the test by your Mr. Phil Clark that the test ran to a full 1 hour duration and was not terminated. We do accept that some transient flaming was evident above the full rig height, although would not classify this as flame spread as referenced in the standard. The insulation fire barrier at this point was not compromised in any way, and the test ran full duration. And then for clarity, based on data we received, we would interpret this as a positive result against the BR 135 assessment criteria, and should this be interpreted any other way by yourselves, we would intend to appeal the result formally. And then you look forward to exploring it further with them, and you refer to a meeting later this week.
Yes.
If we can go briefly now to BRE 403576, we can see that just from these emails that in fact a complaint was lodged. If we look at the email at the bottom of that page, a complaint was lodged with the BRE about this test.
Yes.
And this lady, Marion Bodian, is responding in her capacity as complaints coordinator. I've taken this to mean that you intend to lodge a formal complaint. She says that at the end of that first paragraph. And then your response in the top email of the chain is, hello, Marion, many thanks for acknowledging our position. My interpretation of the current situation is that we do not yet have the formal results. My comments were based on Stephen's initial assessment, which we are to discuss further tomorrow. And that tomorrow was the 9th of May, 2014. Now, you refer to that meeting in your witness statement. If we can go to that at page 54, paragraph 11.7. You tell us there, I recall one significant meeting in which I was involved with Ivor Meredith and 2 individuals from the BRE. I do not recall the date of this meeting. We were very keen to understand the parameters of a test result that had been interpreted as a failure based on observations from the second half of a BS 8414 test. Now, given what we've just been looking at, is it likely that the meeting you're describing here was that meeting on the 9th of May?
Yes.
About the March test?
Yes.
And then you go on, I believe that subsequent to this meeting they clarified their understanding of the test. And if we go over the page, sorry, if we could go to page 55 of the witness statement. Yes, thus lending credence to the necessity for clarification. And if we pick it up again 4 lines down on the right-hand side, beginning we, you say we had interpreted from the available guidance documents and approved document B that the observations from the second half of a BS 8414 test did not factor into whether a test is a pass-fail. Now, can you help us? You refer to approved document B there. We can't find anything in approved document B that gives you any details about the pass-fail criteria in BR 135. It merely just refers to BR 135 as an alternative route.
Yes.
Can you help us as to what you mean there? We had interpreted from the available guidance and approved document B that the observations from the second half hour didn't factor into the pass-fail.
I think that should read BR 135.
Right, thank you. And did the BRE explain this to you at the meeting that you then had, that their interpretation of the latest version of BR 135 was that second half hour did factor into whether it was a pass-fail?
Yes, they did explain. I believe their explanation was on the basis, and I can't recall the wording from BR 135, but there is wording that talks about without any early termination of the full fire load.
Yeah.
Their justification was that the full fire load included the system components on the rig and not just the crib. I'd interpreted it as the crib, and therefore any early termination of the full fire load would have to have been before the 30 minutes, which led me to believe that the pass-fail criteria was in the first 30 minutes and not the second 30 minutes.
I see.
That being supported by the second half of the test being for observations.
Right. Our understanding is that their explanation was based on clause 8.5 of the test standard itself, so they actually referred you to a paragraph in the test standard itself.
Yes.
In 8414, yes. And the upshot was that the BRE did not agree with you, did they? They stood firm.
Correct. They did stand firm.
Yeah. If we can go to BRE 30155592, this is an email you sent to the BRE on the 21st of May. If we go third email down at the bottom of page 1 and on to page 2, you sent to the BRE on the 21st of May. You say, Dear Marion, we write further to our ongoing correspondence in respect of the above testing in order to clarify the specific details of our claims. And then you say at the top of that page, at a recent meeting Friday the 9th of May between you, Mr. Stephen Howard and Mr. Tony Baker, Ivor Meredith and myself, we confirm we still wish to receive the test report according to the test standard and would also like a classification against BR 135. And then you say points verified at the meeting include full draft test report to be supplied at the earliest opportunity. The test was valid and accorded to all needs of the standard. Video evidence from the rearward camera was requested. Now, that second bullet point, you say this was a point verified at the meeting. That's not what the BRE said to you at the meeting, was it? That's what you wanted.
No. Valid meaning that the test was undertaken in accordance with the standard, not that it was a positive result.
I see. But you also wanted, I see, you're saying it was agreed at the meeting, was it, that interpretation against the BR 135 criteria is not limited to the BRE?
Yes.
I see. Now, the BRE had not agreed to provide a classification report to BR 135, had they?
No, not according to that.
If we could look at this point at 6.8 of your witness statement on page 25. And I want to look at the second part of that paragraph, fourth line from the bottom. actually, if we pick it up 5 lines from the bottom, you say the test criteria was very important in understanding the performance in future tests. However, such criteria are completely within the domain of the BRE. It was important to understand this at a high level to help inform the test regime. Those who understood it had read the document itself, openly available to read, and through experience. Now, did you believe in May 2014 that it was open to Kingspan simply to interpret the 8414 test data itself to BR 135 and reach a different conclusion from the BRE?
No, that would have had to have been via another independent body using the BR 135 criteria. They agreed that that was possible.
And you say that such criteria are completely within the domain of the BRE. Do you see that there?
Yes, in that they wrote the classification standard.
Yes. So they understood how those systems should be interpreted, and they understood full well the pass-fail criteria, yes?
Yes.
If we go back to your email to the BRE of the 21st of May, BRE 3015592 on page 2, and look at the penultimate paragraph on page 2. You say this issue is of such significance to Kingspan's business that we've consulted with our lawyers who've confirmed that in their view, BRE's current position cannot be justified. We recognise the influential position BRE hold and do not wish to contradict its views. However, our conviction is such that we may have no other option. Now, that was a clear attempt to put pressure on the BRE to change their decision on the matter. Do you accept that?
Yes, we setting out our position, yes.
If we can go now to an internal BRE chain, BRE 3015594. And the third email from the top, what we can see is that your email has been forwarded to Debbie Smith by Stephen Howard. And she says, please see the bit in yellow. And then going one email up, we can see that Debbie Smith asks Stephen Howard for the background. She says, obviously, I'm unaware of the background to this. It appears as if Kingspan are challenging a test failure based on our interpretation of BR 135. Is this correct? If so, what's the specific problem? And then if we can go up again in this chain, Stephen Howard says, there were flames over the top of the rig at about 43 minutes. This, in our view, means that the test at that point is terminated, and if you do not run for the full 60 minutes, you cannot be classified against BR 135. Kingspan Insulation are contesting the interpretation. This email was sent for info, really. I suspect that they will get A and other to offer a classification against the test report. Now, did Kingspan ever approach any other organisation or individual to try to obtain a BR 135 classification for that March test?
I don't recall that we did, no.
No. And it follows, therefore, that nobody else ever classified that to BR 135, did they?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good moment for a break.
Yes.
At this point.
Right. Well,
That's okay.
we'll take a break at this point. Mr. Millichap, we're going to have a short break. We'll come back at 11:30, please. And please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when you're out of the room.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Right. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mr. Millichap to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on, Mr. Millichap?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, now moving forward with the chronology, and just thinking back to the NHBC situation now, there was a meeting with the NHBC involving Mr. Meredith in April 2014. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And can you remember what Mr. Meredith told you after that meeting about what the NHBC's position had been?
No, not from memory.
No. Now, prior to the July 2014 test, which we're going to come and look at in more detail in a moment, were you aware that another ultimatum had been issued on the 16th of June by the NHBC about the need for test data? And Mr. Meredith had managed to get a reprieve by saying that there was upcoming testing still to be done. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was included in all that correspondence, I believe.
Yeah. So now in terms of we've looked at the March 2014 test in some detail. I'm now going to ask you some questions about what happened from July 2014 onwards, and that test first on the 7th of July 2014. If we can look at an email that we looked at already, KIN 3021907, and if we look on page 2, there's an email sent to you by Mr. Meredith. Now, and this was predominantly about the March 2014 test, but in that last paragraph, we looked at it before. Mr. Meredith is saying, picking it up at the end of the first line, however, the question remains about the insulation we choose to use. Is it possible to share the calorimeter results of the Solstice versus standard versus phosphoric that we performed at the FTT last week? And that next test would be the test in July 2014, yes?
Yes.
And it appears to be being decided between you precisely what the foam would be for that test. Do you agree?
Yes.
And those are references not to the foil facer, but to the composition of the phenolic foam itself, aren't they?
The blowing agent,
Yeah.
essentially, yes.
And the reference to standard, Solstice versus standard versus phosphoric, was standard the as sold, being sold to market K15?
Yes, it would be.
And phosphoric, was that the one that you said might have been used in January 2014?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a catalyst change, actually, I believe. Phosphoric, I'm no chemist, but it's not a blowing agent strictly.
Yeah. So these were all different types of foam at the time that all fell within the potential K15 banner, yes?
Yes, modifications.
Yeah. Now, if we can look at your witness statement, KIN 30208221, page 6, and I want to look at paragraph 3.9. And I want to read the last 8 lines with you. And I'm going to read from the July 2014 test was successful. It's about 8 lines up, about 2/3 of the way down that. So you say the July 2014 test was successful and did meet the BR 135 criteria. For the purposes of preparing this witness statement, I've been shown documents which suggest that there were uncertainties around whether the product that was tested in these tests might have had a 25 micron or 50 micron foil facer. I can't remember which of the 2 foil facer thicknesses was the standard thickness of foil facer on K15 at the time. However, I do not consider that the difference in thickness between 25 micron and 50 micron is significant enough to make the tested product a different product to the standard K15. So you're telling us in your statement about the change to the thickness of the foil facer. You don't tell us about any changes to the foam itself. Can you help us on that? Why was that?
Purely, this was to address this disagreement, which it definitely was a disagreement internally between what the actual foil facer was on those tests. Ivor had a very strong opinion it was a 50 micron foil based on his physical interaction with the product. Production insisted almost as vehemently that it was a 25 micron, so akin to the standard foil.
I see. And I want to ask you about what you say right at the end of that paragraph. You say, however, I do not consider that the difference in thickness between 25 micron and 50 micron is significant enough to make the tested product a different product to the standard K15. What do you mean by that?
By that, I think there was a consensus between myself, Ivor, and Malcolm at the time that it was a 50 micron foil that was tested. It was insisted by production and specifically Gwyn Davis that it were a 25 micron. Given it were his responsibility to supply the product, at the time I believe it was agreed that it was a 25 micron foil that was tested, was the official position. So that statement really is that in that we believed it was a 50 micron foil. If it had been a 25 micron foil, it would have had a negative impact on the result rather than a positive one. So it shouldn't have detracted from the end result that we got.
Okay, I understand that there's this dispute going on, but I just want to understand how you're saying there that the difference in thickness, the doubling in thickness between 25 and 50 micron, isn't significant to make it a different product. Isn't that actually a very significant change?
It's a significant change in itself, but with respect to the test, given it was agreed that there was a thicker foil that was supplied, it wouldn't have had an impact on the outcome of the result.
So you say it's a significant change, but then you say, given it was agreed that a thicker foil was supplied, what's supplied for the test?
Yes.
Yes. And you're saying it wouldn't have had an impact on the outcome of the result?
That's right.
Was Mr. Meredith contending that from a fire point of view, 50 microns was what you needed to try and pass the test?
I'm not sure that was his contention. This was purely over what had actually been supplied for the test itself.
I see.
Can I just ask, isn't the real question here whether the foil on the test sample was the same as that which was put on the ordinary production run? What you say here is you can't remember which thickness of foil was the standard at the time.
Yeah, that's definitely 25.
Was standard?
Yes.
So if 25 was on the test sample, that clearly was reflective of the actual product.
Yes.
In that respect. But if it was 50, it clearly wasn't.
Correct.
And would tend to give a better result.
This was a trial product anyway, so it was never intended to be the same as the product that was being supplied.
No, but the heavier foil would, I think you've said, tend to give a better outcome than the lighter foil.
Potentially, yes.
Potentially.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. We just remind ourselves what the spreadsheet says about this. KIN 3022357 on page 3. It says foil perforated and unperforated 50 micron. And then over the page, foil. Do you see that there? So
yes.
we appear to have been told by Kingspan in its formal position that it was 50 micron foil that was actually tested.
Which was our understanding at the time.
I see.
generally. However, it was definitely disputed.
I see. Did you consider there to be any difference between the fire performance of the standard K15 and the solstice-blown K15 prior to that test?
We wouldn't have understood that prior to that test.
Even though the March 2014 test had been on the solstice-blown product?
Sorry, yes. I don't think we tested an exactly similar system with the standard product according to that earlier test. But I think that there was a feeling, yes, that it was adding to the success of the test. So
Yes.
that it was better performing.
Yes. Had any other tests been carried out to assess the difference in fire performance between standard as sold K15 and solstice-blown K15?
There will have been some smaller scale tests. I believe around this time we'd actually invested in a calorimeter internally to aid with QC, but also to look at variations between these foams.
And were you told about what the results of those tests showed?
I don't think they were available at the time.
But were you subsequently told about what they showed?
I will have been, yes. I can't recall the outcome.
You can't recall
No.
what difference there was between the two? You can't recall?
Not from the calorimetry, no.
Now, if we go now to an email chain from October going into November 2014, KIN 3021904, and I want to start on the top of page 4. There's an email sent by Mr. Meredith to you, Gwyn Davis, Lindsay Hobbs, Adrian Pargeter, and it says, he tells you, I've been advised that the 150mm K15 trial is not usable. This is very bad news. Do we have QC data on the 100mm and 50mm, and is it the same as the 80 and 85mm products previously tested? Do you know what he means there by, or what did you understand him to mean by the K15 trial in the first line?
I believe this will have been trying to source a product for the next test.
I see. And then if we go to the next email up in the chain, page 3, this is sent by Lindsay Hobbs at 1923. She says this, Hi Ivor, the 150mm made by Teal was crystallised, as can happen with solstice-blown foam, and it was always a risk. And she says, we've looked at the boards, carried out lab fire testing and cone calorimetry. The lab fire tests indicate that the more friable the foam, the quicker it burns and the more material is lost through foam being propelled from the sample whilst burning. The friable foam, however, did seem to extinguish sooner. The initial cone results suggest the 150mm ignites much quicker and releases more heat. The 150mm cracked open more readily, allowing more sample to burn. Now, going back to that first paragraph, that first line, she says the 150mm made by Teal. Who was Teal?
Teal is a production site in Holland.
In the Netherlands, a Kingspan site in the Netherlands.
Yes.
And it would appear that what's happened is the solstice-blown foam that you tested in March and July 2014 has crystallised. Do you see that?
I think that, yes, this was material intended to that trial. I'm not sure that it actually made it onto that test.
Sorry, you think that, yes, this was material intended to that trial. I'm not sure it actually made it onto that test. What do you mean, made it onto which test?
The next large-scale fire test.
After October 2014?
Yes.
Right, yes. But what you can see here, can't you, is that you can't produce the solstice-blown foam, can you? It's crystallising.
On this instance, yes.
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 So the product you've trialled and you've managed to successfully get a pass in July 2014, you know can't be produced for general manufacture and circulation, yes?
No, that's not my understanding. I believe it was a struggle in this instance to make it at that thickness. Production of these foams is always more challenging the thicker you get. I believe Ivor had requested as thick as possible a product for an upcoming test, and therefore they had pitched at where they felt they could get a good production trial at the thickest that they possibly could. But in this case, it had obviously not come off.
But this was confirmation, wasn't it, that it couldn't be produced commercially, and you knew that, didn't you?
No, it's not confirmation of that at all. This is trying to produce some boards for an actual test at as great a thickness as possible, and that production trial has failed.
I see.
It doesn't translate that we can't make that product.
Did you ever make that Solstice blown product and sell it for wider distribution?
Not as K15, but yes, in other product ranges, I believe so. Right. Not during my tenure. I believe it was around that time that there was some transition to a K. I think there was an additional number 1 at the beginning of the product description.
So just to be absolutely clear, the product that you tested in July 2014 in that 8414 test, during your time as head of technical, was never sold for general circulation, was it?
Correct.
And you knew that at the time?
Yes, that's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. Did you also know at this time that Kingspan was using that July 2014 8414 test to support and promote the use of standard K15 on high-rise buildings?
No, I don't know that I didn't know that, but that wouldn't have been appropriate, obviously, because it's not the same product.
Well, precisely. You say, I don't know that I didn't know that. Can we be absolutely clear? Did you know that the product that you tested in the July test, the July 2014 test, was not then sold in general circulation? You've said yes.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And then did you know, nevertheless, that Kingspan was seeking to rely upon that July test to support the use of standard K15 for use above 18 metres?
I don't recall that I did know that. This is something actually that I know is referenced in communications I've since reviewed. The move to a new product is a very significant one, and I pointed that out at the time, that clearly if you decide that you are then moving to a new product, you have to make that clear. I don't believe the product was supplied prior to me finishing at Kingspan. I think it was intended that was the case. From this point onwards, I believe the product was even named K115. I think after the fact, I don't believe it ever got to market. But it was a different product, and it should not have been used to support supply of the standard product.
Did you ever make it clear to your team that they couldn't use the July 14 test for that reason, because that's not what you were selling? Did you ever make that clear to them?
Yes, I'd like to hope that I would. I don't believe from the test in July, I believe the test report was available from December of that year.
Well, we're going to come on and look at some correspondence, but I'm trying to ascertain what your general understanding was. And I asked you the question which you've not answered. Did you ever make clear to your team that they couldn't use the July test for that reason, i.e. they couldn't use it to sell standard K15?
I don't know that I did that deliberately in writing, but I feel that would have been obvious because it was understood it was a different product.
Yeah, and you've already said it would be wholly inappropriate to be selling a different product from the one you've tested.
Yes.
And relying on that different test.
Correct.
Well, let's keep going. It's right, isn't it, that someone reading a BRE test report, including that July 2014 test report, would just see K15, wouldn't they? They wouldn't be told that it was a solstice-blown K15 with one side that was perforated, one side unperforated, thicker foil. That was never said, was it, about the product?
I'm not aware how it was labelled in the test. It should have been identified as a trial. I don't believe at the time it was tested it had a different name, but it should have had.
Well, the July test report does not say trial. It does not say K115. It does not say solstice-blown K15 with a thicker foil facer. It just says standard K15, or it refers to what everyone would have understood as the K15 you're selling to market.
Yes.
And you agree that that's inappropriate?
Yes.
Let's look at some correspondence now. KIN 3020736. This is an email from Mr. Meredith to you and a number of others on the 21st of August 2014. And the subject is comment required by Monday 5 p.m, please, K15 update. And essentially what Mr. Meredith's doing is seeking to update you and others about the events on that product since the last meeting a month ago. So he says that in the first lines, as the key stakeholders for K15, I've taken 5 to update you all on the current situation since our last meeting a month ago. And you were one of those key stakeholders, weren't you? Because
yes.
You're a recipient. It's also gone to someone called... Actually, no, that's an error. Sorry. Yes, so looking at I want to start with the very end of his email at point 6 on page 2. He says this: we have issued a couple of standard letters to the larger contractors, Praters, Lakesmere, and confirming our good news, confirming pending reports, and a more general letter confirming test success. These are being used by technical and sales for job-specific queries, which we are targeting handling within 48 hours of receipt. Tony Malcolm, I've not written to Stuart Taylor at Wintech. Has this been done? Do you see that there?
Yes.
So, Mr. Meredith is saying that on the back of the good news, and that can only be the July 2014 test, can't it?
Yes.
That what Kingspan are doing is writing standard letters to the larger contractors, Praters, Lakesmere, and confirming test success. And these are being used by technical and sales for job-specific queries, which we are targeting handling within 48 hours of receipt. So you're using that July test for technical and sales query purposes. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And you knew that at the time?
I must have known that at the time, yes.
And you also must have known that the K15 that you're selling in August 2014 is not the same K15 as that which you've tested in July 2014, yes?
Yes. I believe it was fully the intention that the product would change over. This was clearly a transition period. But yes, it would seem that that's been used to support the existing material.
Can you explain to us how you allowed that to occur?
No, it's been missed. I was very clear on the fact, and I know it's in correspondence that if we were to make this significant a change, then it's a very significant change that would signal a move from the old product to a new product, and that would need to be clear. Clearly, in a transition, this has got missed and overlooked.
Well, Mr. Millichap, I'd suggest to you that this is not just something that's been missed or overlooked. The way this is written, and there's other correspondence we'll come to, it was absolutely deliberate by Kingspan, wasn't it?
It was absolutely our intention to transition to a new product at that time. I know that didn't happen, and you know that time scale got extended. But as far as I recall, at the point when I left Kingspan, I believe that was still the intention, that we would move to that new product, and that would be the supplied product.
But how could you justify that interim period of carrying on selling standard K15?
Only on the basis that, we would be supporting new specifications that would be satisfied with the new product. But I appreciate there is a risk that wouldn't be the case.
Well, clearly here there are projects that you're recommending K15 for, and no one is telling. I mean, we can't find any correspondence where anybody's told, by the way, this test was on a new product that we haven't yet produced, so you do need to be aware of that.
Yes.
Yes. If we go and look at point 1 of this email now, Mr. Meredith, under the heading NHBC BCA, says a meeting's been held with the NHBC whom are still pushing for someone to provide job-specific test data. They are still sanctioning the use of K15 as long as they get a bespoke letter off Kingspan, which technical projects are turning around in 48 hours on receipt of the drawings and confirmation of the fire barrier dimensions. Now, just pausing there, you can't have thought at the time, can you, that what he's referring to there is them having explained that there was a new product. They're just carrying on selling K15 as before. That's right, isn't it?
That does seem to be the case. But again, it was fully the intention to move to the new product at that time.
He carries on, they've also given us an extra 3 months to get some further assessments on the test data to meet their needs. We have also requested 2 weeks notification if they decide to change their stance. Steve Evans was also involved in the BCA publication attached, which has been driven by them following the confusion in interpretation of our high-rise regulations. I've highlighted some parts of this document as it clearly singles out polyurethane as not being suitable but doesn't mention PF. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you authorise those bespoke letters that were being turned around in 48 hours?
Yes, I believe that was came out of the discussions with the NHBC to support them going forward.
At the end of Mr. Meredith's email, he includes the minutes of an earlier meeting on these issues held on the 15th of July 2014. If we can see that from page 3 of this document. Can you see date of meeting, Tuesday the 15th of July, and we can see you were present at that meeting. And if we go to action point, under test reports letters, under action point 2, it says TM, would that be you, Tony Millichap?
Yes, I assume so.
To write reports letters to be used as a marketing commercial tool to announce the result of the test and get on the front foot in the market. Action TM. So it would appear that you were to be actively involved in using that July test as a marketing and commercial tool. Do you agree?
Yes.
And that's what you did, isn't it? You went on and did that.
I believe so, yes.
And then under the heading Market Launch, which is towards the bottom of page 3, it says there, and I think this might be what you were referring to earlier, consideration needs to be given as to either launching this product with a new code, K20, at, and then some figures are given, or keep K15 brand and use across all heights. Decision will be taken on this after further testing. So some consideration does seem to be given at this point as to whether to launch this product with a new code, with a K20 code. But there was certainly there's no indication in these minutes that anyone was going to stop selling the current version of K15, is there?
No, but that was fully the intention.
Well, why isn't that minuted in this meeting? You're present at it. It's a meeting held on the 15th of July, so a week or so after that successful test. Why don't we see anybody saying, well, we can't market this yet because it's not the product we're selling. We must transfer over to that trial product and then we can market it.
Yes, I can only assume that we planned that this would happen quicker than it did at the time. I know that there were additional concerns with the Solstice product being commercially viable that weren't considered at an early enough point.
Can you help us as to why none of that's mentioned in your witness statement to the inquiry?
No, I was answering the specific questions.
If we can now go to KIN 30010825. Now, this is a series of internal emails sent just after that July 2014 test, that successful test on terracotta tiles. And if we go to the very first email in the chain at page 2, we see that Mr. Meredith at 16:07, so on the 7th of July, so later in that afternoon, and he's announcing it to you, Malcolm Rochford, Gwyn Davis, etc., BS 8414 Part 2 News, and he announces the result. Between 11:30 and 12:30 today, we tested Cooltherm K15 behind a ventilated terracotta rain screen at BRE Garston. We've just had the data provisionally verified and it meets the criteria for the full test duration, no flaming above the second fire barrier, and he attaches pictures. So he announces that to the team. And then if we move up the chain, and just to be clear, you're not copied into the emails that then follow, but I nevertheless want to ask you about them.
Okay.
At 7:34 the next morning, the next email in the chain, Richard Bromwich writes to Alistair Lambie and David Collier with good news, lads. Now, Alistair Lambie was the head of business development at Kingspan, is that right?
I'm not sure he would have been at this time. I believe Richard Bromwich would have been in that role at that time. I believe Alistair did take that role.
Yeah. And who is David Collier? What was his role?
He's, I believe, would have been another business development manager.
Yeah. And then we can see a response from Alistair Lambie 10 minutes later. You can see at the bottom of that page, so this is very early the next morning, 7:45. He says, effing happy days. I think we've just pissed over Nauf, Extratherm and Rockwool. Marketing campaign, Ali. And then what I want to ask you about is Richard Bromwich's immediate response. Just a few minutes later, or almost immediately, Richard Bromwich responds, on it, mate, despite the attempts of slaphead Millichap saying we shouldn't because it's not a compelling story. Grr. Now, in fairness to you, we want to put this to you. Were you saying that you shouldn't have a marketing campaign because it wasn't a compelling story?
I had pointed out that if we were moving to that product, which was fully the intention, then obviously that product needs to be identified as a different product.
And who had you pointed that out to?
I've seen that in a couple of, definitely the fire focus group, I think, predominantly. So the senior team responsible.
Right. Did any of these men know that the test that had been carried out was actually on a research and development product? Do you know? How widely was that information known within Kingspan?
Yes, I believe it would have been. I mean, Richard Bromwich was the most senior representing the sales efforts. He will have been kept abreast of those developments. I don't recall, but I believe he would have been invited to the fire focus group. I'm not sure if he attended.
Right. What about Adrian Pargeter? Did he know that it was a trial product that was different to that you were selling?
Yes, I believe it was common knowledge.
Right. Did you disagree in the event with the plan to promote and market standard K15 on the basis of the test that you knew not to have been on that K15?
It's difficult to recall the exact chronology. At the time this was written and the test was being discussed and put out there, I know it was clearly the intention that would be the product that was being supplied. And in that case, yes, there will have been a transition where there was a potential risk of crossover, but that should have been a minimal risk. As it transpired, I know the production side of the business weren't able to deliver that product when, clearly it had previously been considered we were able to deliver that product. Giving it a name and talking about marketing campaigns means you've got a product that we can put to market. It didn't obviously transpire that way, and I don't believe that product ever got supplied,
No.
to my knowledge.
Did you ever communicate to anybody concerns about public safety or life safety involved with just carrying on selling the standard K15 at this time?
Not specifically in those terms, but no.
Can we go now to another email, KIN 3021810? And the second email in this chain is from you to Richard Burnley on the 12th of November 2014. And the subject is K15 testing direction. And you say, further to our meeting of earlier today, I've set out our understanding of the published Celotex RS 5000 result and its current impact. You go on. Initially, having sourced a copy of Celotex marketing blurb, we were not surprised of the vagueness surrounding the specifics of the test construction, notably around the provision of fire breaks. Further efforts finally secured a copy of the actual test report, albeit this was missing the relevant pages relating to the test construction. Upon receipt of the actual construction designs, these were reduced to photocopies, again lacking clarity. The report's text references 4 horizontal fire breaks. However, the sketch is unclear how these are positioned. I do suspect from their construction designs that a critical panel joint that's essential to the test and influences the result is missing from the Celotex design. I'm not confident we have enough clarity to challenge this officially with BRE, but we will raise it in any case. And then you say you're only aware of one project where Celotex product's been adopted, which involved the same supply chain as their test programme. We've yet to be asked to defend specification against the product. We are actively involved in supporting 60-plus projects, specifically on the over 18-metre issue. Whilst we had to financially support the project at First Street, Manchester, this specification held and we have not lost a specification since. Feedback from specialist subcontractors, specifiers and consultants all raised doubts over the Celotex solution. In light of the fact we cannot produce K15 100% Solstice either commercially or from a production perspective, I would advocate we test the blended product once lambda and costs are acceptable. I've included Malcolm's cost assessment. To revert to testing standard NT, new technology K15, will not support the strategy we are pursuing with ARUPS and NHBC, but will signal a backward step with significant consequence. The above approach assumes we continue to acknowledge differences between the tested products. Both blowing agent facing thickness have significant impact. All testing has been referenced back to precise batches with control samples, as is a requirement of the BRE. However, this does not include a description of the physical differences. The next test is scheduled for the end of November. So, in this email, 12th of November 2014, far from being reticent about carrying on selling standard K15, you're positively pushing it, aren't you? You're saying to colleagues, we've got to go head-to-head with Celotex and we've got to maintain our position in the marketplace. That's the thrust of what you're saying.
I'm supporting at this point. We had committed to that product, and that was what we needed to carry forward with, because that's where the test evidence lay.
If we go back up and look at the top of the email chain, the top of this email, you say you'd obtained a copy of the BRE's test report for Celotex on a system incorporating RS5000. Can you help us? How did you obtain a copy of that report?
I understand it was Ivor supplied that to me, but I believe it was sourced via the sales team. I don't know where they would have got it from.
Right. And when you say in the third paragraph, I do suspect from their construction design that a critical panel joint that's essential to the test and influences the result is missing from the Celotex design, how did you come to say that?
It was a conclusion that Ivor had shared with me from what we could see of the test. There was a panel joint is expected to be created centrally above the crib to create a worst case scenario, a weak point, if you like, in the cladding. I believe Ivor suggested that was one way by avoiding that joint that Celotex could have been successful.
Right. Did you ever challenge that? You float in this email the possibility that you might challenge the Celotex result officially with the BRE. Was that ever challenged with the BRE?
Not to my knowledge. It may have, Ivor may have said something verbally, but not that I recall was recorded.
And then in that fifth paragraph down, fourth paragraph down, we're only aware of one project where Celotex has been adopted. You then go on and explain in the second and third lines, we are actively involved in supporting 60 plus projects, specifically on the over 18 metre issue. What do you mean by actively involved in supporting 60 plus projects?
That would be projects that were specifically flagged to be above 18 metres and had some support from the technical department. Right.
And then you talk about the First Street Manchester project. That was the project where we saw the credit note being issued.
Yes.
And I think you're referring to that here, is that right, when you say we had to financially support the project?
Yes.
But what do you mean then when you say, whilst we had to financially support that project, this specification held? What does that mean?
From memory, there were two phases or two separate buildings on that project, and I believe the first phase, there may have even been different project teams. I'm not sure. There may have been some consistency with different subcontractors. I don't recall, but I believe one of the specifications held on one of the buildings. The monetary support was obviously a contribution towards them having to replace the project on the other phase.
I see. So when you say it held, i.e. K15 did get installed onto that particular building in that project?
On one of those buildings, yes. I believe there was more than one or a different phase of that same building.
And that was a high-rise project?
I believe it was, yes.
Yeah. And you go on and say, in light of the fact we cannot produce K15 100% Solstice either commercially or from a production perspective. So contrary to what you said earlier today, by this point, you clearly know that you can't produce that Solstice commercially or from a production perspective. That's clear in this email, isn't it?
Yes.
And when had you learnt that? Was that because it was crystallising? Was that because of what you were told by Lindsay Hobbs that we previously looked at?
No, this would have been via ongoing meetings with production, whereby they were now suggesting that to make the product didn't make commercial sense. I believe the Solstice blowing agent itself, there was some uncertainty on whether it were available in the quantities that would have been required. I believe it was a completely new product. Again, these things were dealt with by production, but as I understood it, there was obviously efforts for to be able to source that blowing agent in volumes that would be able to support the production. And I believe that whether there were some early arrangements that couldn't be followed through.
But at this point, if you know it can't be produced, then there cannot have been any further intention to transition to supplying that product to market, can there?
I believe there was still an intention to move the product to a Solstice product, but using a blended. I don't know what the percentages would be, but a mixture essentially of Solstice and another blowing agent.
Why do you not say here in this email, in light of the fact we can't produce Solstice commercially or from a production perspective, we cannot rely on that July 14 8414 test to market the K15 we're currently selling?
I think I reference it, albeit tentatively, when I talk about a backward step with significant consequence. I think that should be plainly understood. The test is on a different product, and therefore it can't continue to support what's being supplied into the market.
Well, that sentence you've just highlighted, where you say to revert to testing standard new technology K15 will not support the strategy. Wasn't that because, so you can't produce the Solstice commercially or from a production perspective, that's the one you've successfully tested, and you can't revert back to testing standard new technology K15 because you know that performs badly in fire. That's right, isn't it?
No, my reading of that is that to revert to testing standard new technology K15 will then signal another U-turn with those people that we are trying to give additional assurance to. At this point, I believe it was still the intention that we would move to the new product.
But how does that signal a backward step to those individuals when none of them know anything about these trial products? They don't know anything about the new technology performing badly. They don't know anything about Solstice blown or thicker foils. How does it signal a backward step to them?
I appreciate it wouldn't have at that time, but the intention still was to move to a new product, launch that new product, and at that time the test evidence would support the product that was being supplied.
Right. Well, I'd suggest to you that a more natural reading of that, given everything we know up to this point, when you're writing this, is that what you're saying is we can't revert to testing standard new technology K15 because you knew full well that couldn't pass in an 8414 test, given what had happened in 2007 and 2008.
I suppose it could be read that way. I don't believe that was my intention at the time.
Yeah.
We were fully committed to moving forward with this new product at this point.
Right. And just to be clear, the blended product would be a different product again. Is that right? So it would be, what, part Solstice, part what?
I don't know. That would have to be a question for production. They were, at this point, given they were now saying, that wasn't a viable way forward. They were obviously looking at alternates.
Well, you refer to, you say, I would advocate we test the blended product. What was the blended product as you understood it at that point?
It was a potential route forward that production had identified.
I see. Now, we can also see, if we look at the bottom of this email, that in the paragraph third up from the bottom, you say the above approach assumes we continue to acknowledge differences between the tested products. And you say this, both blowing agent and facing thickness have significant impact. So can we take it that at this time you did understand that both the blowing agent and the facing thickness did have a significant impact on the product's fire performance?
Yes.
And you also tell us that all testing has been referenced back to precise batches with control samples, as it's a requirement of BRE. However, this does not include a description of the physical differences. So is it right that at this time you knew exactly what K15 product had been tested on every occasion from January, March, July onwards, yes?
I believe that was the case. I believe production were required to confirm that directly to the BRE. Due to intellectual property, I wasn't aware of the SOPs for the product.
So you accept that you knew that the K15 product being sold could not, on the basis of the test data you had, be supplied. Sorry. Did you yourself at any stage give any consideration to whether or not this course of action was appropriate and responsible?
Yes, I was concerned. We were in a position where we had committed to supplying another product, and that was getting pulled from under us. That product was now being said it couldn't be produced.
Did you ever have any discussions with Adrian Pargeter, Richard Burnley or Malcolm Rochford about the appropriateness of carrying on selling standard technology K15 in these circumstances?
I will have had, but not that I can bring attention to or that was put into writing. Now,
I want to go back now and look at the situation between Kingspan and the Nhbc again. Now, it's right, isn't it, that discussions between Kingspan and the Nhbc about the use of K15 in buildings over 18 metres continued throughout July 2014 and through to the end of that year and into the early part of 2015.
Yes.
During that time, in any correspondence or meetings with the Nhbc in which you were involved, did you ever inform the Nhbc that the test to 8414 Part 2 carried out in July 2014 had been carried out not on as-sold K15 but on a research and development product?
I wouldn't have done that personally, no. That would have been the intention, and that would have been something that Ivor should have done. But I think the position with the transition to a new product not getting resolved has clearly muddied the waters around that.
You say that would have been the intention. You mean it would have been the intention to tell the Nhbc that?
Absolutely. At the point that we knew that the new product could be launched. Unfortunately, that didn't come.
What about before that? What about while you're still selling standard K15 on the back of that July test? Would there have been an intention to tell the NHBC about it at that time?
Yes, at that time when the new product became available, it would have been launched as that and been obvious in the market.
And you said either should have done what?
It would have been Ivor's job to communicate that at the point that we were able to supply. I believe his announcement was intending, informing the direction of travel. And at that time, we collectively, I believe there was enough confidence that that is what would happen, but that didn't transpire to come to be.
Mr. Meredith's evidence, when he gave oral evidence to us, was that he would have been out on his ear had he said anything about this to the NHBC. Do you agree?
No, I don't. To my recollection, this was the direction of travel. We were moving from the standard product we were supplying to a new product. The difficulty comes in that the confidence we had in moving to that new product disappeared because it wasn't able to be made commercially or from a production perspective latterly from a production point of view.
Right.
Can I just ask a question? I'm rather puzzled by this. As I understand it, your sales team were selling what we'll call from him the old product, the existing product.
Yes.
On the back of or using as a basis the new test result.
I believe the new test result had been announced to the market, and potentially it was used to support new specifications on the premise that...
Well, you hadn't got a new specification yet, had you?
That's correct, but at the time that the information was put to the sales team, it was intended that would be the case.
I understand that part of your evidence. What's puzzling me is how do you launch a new product on the basis of a test that's just been used to sell an old product?
I don't believe the intention at the time was that the test would be selling the old product. This would have been writing new specifications that had not come to be.
But I thought we'd established that the July test was being used in support of sales of the existing product.
I think that there was a risk that could have happened in that transition, which ended up being longer than it was intended or should have been.
But then my question remains, how do you sell a new product? Let's say you called it K20. How do you sell K20 using as your support a test which has been used to sell K15? Aren't people going to be a bit puzzled?
Yes, and this is why it would need to, at the point it could have been supplied to market, it would have had to have been identified separately. Honestly, at the time, you're right, I don't think enough thought was given to how that would be identified. That announcement, in retrospect, was premature.
All right, thank you. Yes, Grange.
Yeah, I mean, you've said there that there was a risk that you could have been selling K15, standard K15, in that transition period on the back of that test, which was a different test. But what I'm going to put to you is that that was the deliberate strategy of Kingspan at the time, and all the documentation supports that. It wasn't just a risk that might arise. That's what you intended the moment you got that successful test, wasn't it?
That was never my deliberate intention. It was always intended that a new product would be released. As I say, that the fact that new product could then not be produced as it was intended meant that launch got delayed indefinitely in the end. And obviously, yes, put us in that dubious position.
You say that was never my deliberate intention, but were you aware at the time, I'd suggest you must have been from the correspondence we've just looked at, that others around you were using that test straight away to justify the use of standard K15 being sold on high-rise buildings?
Yes, I think that information was released prematurely.
Yes, and they were doing that deliberately, weren't they, knowing that it had been tested on a different product. You agree?
My only counter to that is that it wasn't deliberate, given that it was our intention that the product would change.
Right. Let's look at some other correspondence now. KIN 406074. We go down page 1 from the third email from the top. We can see that Steve Evans from the NHBC on the 14th of July 2014 at 9:49, he says to Ivor Meredith, "Dear Ivor, please find attached copies of recent communications that NHBC have had with DCLG," so that's the Department for Communities and Local Government, "in respect of the fire safety and facades. I've also been keeping colleagues at the Building Control Alliance, LABC, and the Fire Brigade up to date with the progress of our discussions. As I think he means stated in the communication with DCLG at our meeting on the 6th of August 2014, NHBC will be looking for evidence from Kingspan that supports the use of K15 above 18 metres outside of the constraints of the current BBA certificate." And then he looks forward to seeing you in August. And then in the email above, Mr. Meredith forwards that to you. He says the attached can be used to justify our need for a meeting. Why would he say that? Why would he say to you, this can be used to justify our need for a meeting? Was there not a desire to have a meeting about this?
I think it's, on first reading of that, I think it's the opposite. There was a desire to have a meeting with the NHBC.
Did you read the attachment to Steve Evans's email, i.e. the correspondence that he'd forwarded from between the NHBC and Mr. Brian Martin at DCLG?
I don't recall without seeing it.
Well, let's look at it now. KIN 406071. And if we go to the bottom of page 1, we can see that yes, so this is what he attached. So on the 2nd of July 2014 at 11:42, from Brian Martin to Neil Smith at the NHBC. And Mr. Martin says this: "Hi Neil, I've been talking to a few folk about fire safety and facades recently. Allegedly, several buildings have been erected where PIR insulation has been used in cladding panels well over 18 metres in height. Apparently, people are under the impression that PIR is a material of limited combustibility, which it isn't. Again, allegedly, many of these buildings are blocks of flats. I've no idea how true these allegations are, but they come from relatively reliable sources. The purpose of my email is a friendly warning. You might want to double check with your inspectors and plan checkers that they are on top of this. Happy to discuss. Regards, Brian." Now, does this help as to whether you did look at that correspondence that Mr. Meredith had forwarded on to you?
Yes, it doesn't bring a recollection, but if it were attached on the email forwarded to me, then I would have read it.
Do you remember being aware that there'd been discussions between the NHBC and DCLG about insulation being used over 18 metres in height in inappropriate circumstances?
No.
You don't remember being aware of that?
No.
If we go to the next email up in the chain, this is Mr. Evans's response to Brian Martin, which you were also sent. You were sent this whole chain. And Steve Evans says to Brian Martin, "Dear Brian, I hope that you're well. Neil Smith has discussed your email with me below and asked me to respond as I have been dealing with this on behalf of NHBC. This is an issue that NHBC are well aware of and have been in discussions with industry about it for some time. The issue is in respect of the use of Kingspan Cooltherm K15 rain screen board in buildings over 18 metres in height. The confusion has arisen from Kingspan's statement that their product is acceptable for use in buildings over 18 metres. However, the product is made from a generic type of polyurethane foam, which is, by nature, combustible. However, since 27th of October 2008, the product held a BBA certificate attached, which indicates that it is acceptable for use in accordance with Approved Document B, Volume 2, Paragraph 12.7, subject to advice being should be sought from the certificate holder, 7.2. If the building exceeds 18 metres in height, it was on this basis that NHBC Building Control and other building control bodies accepted the use of K15 in buildings over 18 metres in height, including blocks of flats. We understand that LABC have also issued a registered detail approving the material for use over 18 metres. In January of this year, we were made aware of a revised BBA certificate for K15 issued on the 17th of December 2013, also attached. The new certificate removed the passage which indicated that it was acceptable for use in accordance with Approved Document B, Volume 2, Paragraph 12.7, and instead states that the product will not contribute to the development stages of a fire, but that it has only been tested and therefore is only suitable for one specific construction on masonry walls. We had a number of projects under construction and in advanced stages of design utilising K15. NHBC approached Kingspan and made them aware of our concerns. As a result of this dialogue, Kingspan are currently undertaking further testing using different cladding and facade treatments in accordance with 8414 Part 2. The results from the test are expected by the end of this month, and NHBC are meeting with Kingspan at the beginning of August, at which time Kingspan will be asked to provide evidence that their product can be used in alternative construction types other than that specified in the current BBA certificate. There is no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Kingspan are confident that the testing currently underway will prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres. If they are not able to do this, we will begin the process of informing industry that the product is no longer suitable for use in facades over 18 metres, as well as informing other stakeholders, such as BCA and the Fire and Rescue Service, although both parties are already aware of our ongoing discussions. I trust that this addresses your immediate concerns, and I will keep you informed further developments. In the meantime, if you have any queries, please feel free to get in touch. Now, I've read that out in full. Do you remember reading that and being aware of that?
Yes, I would have read that.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that DCLG's awareness of the situation in July 2014 increased the pressure on Kingspan to provide the evidence that the NHBC had been seeking?
I don't recall that specifically. There was definitely increased urgency or a need to assist NHBC with their concerns.
Did it give you any pause for thought at all in terms of what you were doing at the time, that the DCLG had now been alerted to these issues and had been told this by NHBC? Did that in any way make you question what you were carrying on doing?
Yes, we constantly questioned ourselves, and we're being as collaborative with NHBC as we could.
But what action did you take as a result? You say you were constantly questioning. Did you actually do anything as a result of being aware of this?
Yes, we continued with a test program to help satisfy their concerns.
Did it make you think carefully about whether to keep relying on the July 2014 test
I don't recall whether that test was identified to the NHBC. I know there was a discussion between myself and Ivor about that test being identified as not representing the current product that was supplied. I don't know how that report was represented to the NHBC.
Did it give you any pause for thought that the Fire and Rescue Service were said to be aware of these ongoing discussions?
Absolutely. I never, took light of the implications of a product used in this scenario.
If we can go to your response internally to this, it's at KIN 406075. And if we look at the second email down from the top of the page, so Mr. Meredith said to you below this, the attached can be used to justify our need for a meeting. We looked at that earlier. And then you respond to Mr. Meredith, Ivor, firstly, please let Richard, Mark and Karen know they are not to respond in any way. As we have received this directly, we will likely need to rebut some of the claims which are inaccurate whilst keeping them on side. We do not need to action anything ahead of tomorrow's meeting, but I will inform Toby Randall. Now, Toby Randall was Kingspan's solicitor, is that right?
Yes.
Now, other than Steve Evans having said in his email to Brian Martin that K15 was a polyurethane foam as opposed to a phenolic foam, which was clearly an error, which claims did you consider inaccurate in what was said in Steve Evans's email to Mr. Martin?
Could we go back to the...
Of course. So it's at KIN 406071. That's Steve Evans back to Brian Martin. Please take time to read that if you need.
Thank you. I believe I was referring to the polyurethane foam. I don't see anything else in there that I would question.
No. And did you have a meeting on the back of receiving this? It looks in the emails like you were planning an internal meeting to discuss this. Did that take place?
Yes,
Go back to that,
it.
KIN 406075. You talk about don't action anything ahead of tomorrow's meeting. What was discussed at that meeting?
This will have been a senior team meeting to agree on how we continue to progress the discussions and hopefully a resolution with the NHBC.
And would Adrian Pargeter have been at that meeting?
Quite likely, but not necessarily. His role was still market and product development. I believe this would have been the senior team, so the managing director, Malcolm.
Did you draw this correspondence between NHBC and the DCLG to the attention of your superiors, and if so, who?
Yes. I believe from this point forward, the entire content of the correspondence and everything that was relayed back and forth with the NHBC was relayed via Toby Randall to keep a watching brief, and all correspondence was copied through the managing director, Malcolm Roachford, amongst others, I believe legal as well at group.
When you refer to the managing director, who are you referring to there?
Peter Wilson at that time.
Yeah. And what about higher up than that? Did it go up any further than that?
I know latterly, particularly when we were working under Toby Randall's direction, that was being tracked via Lorcan Dowd and Tommy Riley at group.
Right. Now, after this correspondence, Kingspan sent a letter to the NHBC on the 3rd of August 2014. If we could go to that letter, KIN 402186.
Sorry,
yes.
could I just, I believe the managing director at that time was likely Richard Burnley.
Right.
He would have been involved, but also Peter Wilson would have been involved as divisional managing director.
Yes, thank you. So if we can go to Kingspan's letter back to the NHBC on the 3rd of August 2014, KIN 402186. If we look at the bottom of page 2, this letter is signed by Mr. Meredith, but it's copied to, if we look on the bottom of page 2, it's copied to Richard Bromwich, Richard Burnley, and to you.
Yes.
And do you remember who drafted this letter?
I believe that will have been drafted between all of those. There would have been input. That could I just have a look at some of the content?
Oh, of course. Sorry. So let's read it. We write further to your correspondence on the use of cool therm K15 in building facades above 18 metres. We note your comments and would take this opportunity to correct a number of points. And in that first paragraph, Mr. Meredith corrects the NHBC about the type of insulation Kingspan are producing, making clear it's not a polyurethane, but it's a phenolic.
Yes.
And then in paragraph 2, he carries on, our significant test portfolio, alongside many precedents in gaining approval standards, lobbying and extended involvement with fire consultants over many years, has afforded Kingspan with a deep understanding of the regulatory framework in this area. Given Kingspan's confidence the product is fit for purpose and working within this framework, our only practical option to demonstrate compliance is via a fire safety engineering approach. The prohibitive cost and recognised lack of scope of approval within 8414 and BR 135 demands this. Now, just pausing there, do you know what's being referred to by the significant test portfolio?
Yes, there was a significant amount of information logged with NHBC at this time. It will have included, obviously, the 8414 test result. It will have included the LABC registered details, BBA certificates, small-scale tests, assessments, I believe even some fire resistance testing.
In terms of 8414 testing that was in that portfolio, can we agree that that could have only been the 2005 test, which was not carried out on the K15 product actually sold after September 2006, and the July 2014 test, which was carried out on the research and development product? Do you agree? That's all you had at that time?
That is all we had at that time.
Yeah. And what standards lobbying and extended involvement with fire consultants are being referred to in that second line of that second paragraph?
That will have been Ivor's work in British Standard Committees, and obviously, over his extended career.
And the extended involvement with fire consultants over many years, what's that referring to?
Again, it will have been predominantly I was involvement with various fire consultants.
And who were those fire consultants? Did you know when this letter was written?
Yes, I believe an awful lot of work was done via Xover. We had also used, the names aren't coming to mind, but there was a significant amount of work done around fire resistance in other applications, such as timber frame, that Ivor would have been involved with, that would have involved fire consultants. There was a business based in Bristol that I know Ivor had a good working relationship with.
Just to be clear, none of that work was on 8414 testing, was it?
But some of that work would have been on 8414 testing with, not testing, but assessments.
I see. Desktop assessments, extrapolations.
Yes.
I see. Had the significant test portfolio actually been sent to the NHBC at this time? You're talking about, or Kingspan are talking about a significant test portfolio. To your knowledge, had that actually been sent to the NHBC so they could see that?
Yes.
And then if we go on to paragraph, so just to finish off this page, you then say at the bottom, for absolute clarity, Kingspan Insulation are confident the cool firm K15 can be appropriate for use in the application and would be deeply concerned by the implication NHBC may choose to advise industry to the contrary. What did that mean? Can be appropriate for use in the application. Does that just mean over 18 metres?
Yes, essentially all uses of the product were referred to as applications, whether that was using a wall, roof or a floor.
And then in the second half of that paragraph, it says, in the event NHBC were to offer contrary advice to the wide industry, we would request 14 days prior notice in order that we may consider our position further. This is particularly pertinent given the number of bodies you have undertaken to keep informed. And then if we can go over the page and look at the top paragraph, it said, as part of the test portfolio, we have completed 2 further successful tests to BS 8414 Part 2 this year and currently await their interpretation to BR 135. Now, what were those 2 successful tests to BS 8414?
They would have to have been the 2014 tests.
Yes, but which ones?
Sorry.
This letter's being sent in August 2014, so you've got the January 14 test, the March 14 test, and the July 14 test.
It would have been the March and July tests.
So you're saying in this letter that that's a successful test, even though you knew full well that the BRE did not think so?
Yes, it was our interpretation that there was some value to be taken from that test.
You carry on. These tests have been commissioned to demonstrate a range of approval and include scope for insulation thickness and cladding finish type. We've also reached some agreement with regards to extending the scope of this testing in line with comments from your Dave White with regards to the possibility to put flexible insulation fill between the steel frame stud-work. Now, nowhere in this letter is there any mention of the fact that both of those tests, March 14 and July 15, were on a trial product that you weren't actually selling. That's not said in this letter, is it?
No.
And then you go on, as with all large and complex buildings, a fire safety engineering approach is recommended as the only practical way of achieving fire safety. Our test information and its assessment is intended to best inform building control professionals in order that a decision can be made to its appropriateness or as evidence towards compliance via a fire safety engineering approach as allowed by our regulations. Ultimately, the success of the specification depends on acceptance of building control and the wider project team. And then you say the BS 8414 Part 2 report that's attached is a draft that does require some slight adjustments. Prudent to give you a copy of this document. However, we request this is not circulated. Which test report was that was being provided? Was that the July 14th
I believe that's
test?
the terracotta pass, yes.
Yeah. And it carries on receipt of the final test information and ARUP and BRE assessments, this will be introduced into the BBA certificate and LABC registered details. However, it is the intention of Kingspan Installation Limited to share this information with the NHBC prior to this. We trust the above meets your approval. Should you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact myself or Richard. Now, can you explain how that letter came to be written? Serious concerns have been raised by the NHBC. You know that the DCLG are now involved. Can you explain how Kingspan have come to write a letter in those terms? Key pieces of information omitted.
At the time, it was this was all what we believed to be the position. As we discussed earlier, the change in the product for these two tests was fully committed to at that time. It didn't come off in that way, but for my entire the time I worked at Kingspan, it was my belief that that product was to be launched, and we were working on that basis, that those tests would represent product that was being supplied.
Well, what I'm going to suggest to you is that actually it was a deliberate lie, all of this. It wasn't just inadvertent. It was a deliberate strategy on the part of Kingspan to deceive not only the NHBC and other professionals, but by now potentially DCLG in giving the response you've just given.
That was never my intention.
Mr. Chairman, is that a good moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Mr. Millichap, we're going to have a break now for some lunch, so
Yeah.
we'll return at 2 o'clock, please, and usual request, please don't talk to anyone
Of course.
about your evidence.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much. Good. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please. Okay.